And as Randall has mentioned, let me say good afternoon to members of the media. We want to thank you very much for coming out to be with us at such very short notice. We've called this press conference somewhat hurriedly in light of the sense of urgency that must surround this report that we have heard that Grand Etang, or some portion of Grand Etang, or some portion of the Grand Etang Forest Reserve is now the target of government's last sellout. And we thought it important, first of all, to call you here, first to register our grave concern regarding this report, and secondly, to express our total dissatisfaction, our total frustration, in fact, our total disgust with the continued and blunt refusal by the government to come clean with the population and to give reports and to give accounts and to tell the nation what exactly is going on in respect of some of the properties that are government's public lands, the patrimony of the state, that are either being sold or given away without any explanation, without any accounting, and under a cloud of secrecy. So we are extremely concerned about this situation. Now, yesterday, the Minister for Implementation, Minister Otway, appeared on the GBN to the Point program. Somebody called in and said that they had heard or had reason to believe that the government had decided to give away or to lease 30 acres of lands in the Grand Etang area that were to sell. And we don't know exactly what it was, but to dispose of 30 acres of land in the Grand Etang area that was part of the Forest Reserve. And the caller was asking of the minister whether she was in a position to confirm or to deny that report. The minister answered by effectively saying that it was her understanding that certain parts of Grand Etang have been put aside for development purposes. This is how she answered the question, by saying that certain parts of Grand Etang have been put aside for development purposes. We were not clear from that answer. She evidently did not answer the question that was put to her, and we are not clear from the answer that she gave whether in fact the lands that were put aside, first of all, who put aside those lands? Secondly, whether or not, if the government put aside these lands, whether or not these lands are private lands or public lands, and if it is public lands, whether or not these public lands constitute a part of the Grand Etang Forest Reserve. These are important questions because there are laws governing the Grand Etang Forest Reserve. And not only the reserve, but there are lands governing forest reserves in general in Grenada, and lands governing lands that are contiguous to or lie adjoining to forests in Grenada, forest reserves in Grenada. Members of the media, in 1906, in June of 1906, just about 110 years ago, next month will be 110 years, the British Parliament, because we were not an independent state at that time, the British Parliament passed a law known as the Grand Etang Forest Reserve Act, 110 years ago. The explanation of the title for this law was an act to provide for the preservation of forest growth in the vicinity of the Grand Etang as a forest reserve for the benefit of Grenadians, or for the benefit of Grenada. That's what this act was about. 1906, 110 years ago. Keep in mind, 110 years ago, there were no international agreements governing these environmental issues of biodiversity and ecosystems. There was no issue of climate change. There was no COP21, the Paris Agreement. None of the issues dealing with deforestation and degradation of lands were on the table 110 years ago. Yet, the British Parliament, in the interest of Grenada and for the benefit of Grenada, not Grenadians, the British Parliament in the interest of Grenada and for the benefit of Grenada, passed this law, an act to provide for the preservation of forest growth in the vicinity of Grand Etang as a forest reserve for the benefit of Grenada. It is interesting that the law has certain preambles, and the very first preamble to this law reads as follows: whereas it is of vital importance for the conservation and promotion of the rainfall and water supply of the island, that the forest growth in the vicinity of the Grand Etang should be maintained and preserved. That's the first preamble to this particular law, 1906. And then the law goes on to create the Grand Etang Forest Reserve. It says, the lands depicted, defined, and delineated shall be called or shall be preserved as the Grand Etang Forest Reserve. And then section 3 of the law explains the purpose of the reserve. And it says this: all lands, and this is of interest, all lands aforesaid shall forever hereafter form part of government land and shall be strictly reserved and set aside for the public purpose of forest conservation. So what this law does in section 3 is to protect the patrimony, is to protect the heritage, and to say that Grand Etang shall forever hereafter be treated as government lands and shall be strictly reserved and set apart for the public purposes of forest conservation, which means nobody can take the forest and do anything else with it. This protects it forever, forever be preserved. That is what we want done in the Constitution with Cameron Park. So we'll talk about that another time. But that's the language that is used in the 1906 legislation, saying that Grand Etang will forever hereafter be preserved as a forest reserve for the benefit of Grenadians. Now, in 1949, 67 years ago, so this one was 110 years ago. In 1949, 67 years ago, before we got independence again, the government passed, the legislature passed a law, again under the aegis of the British, passed a law known as the Forest, Soil and Water Conservation Act. Forest, Soil and Water Conservation Act. And this particular law was amended again in 1967, was amended again in 1984. But this law also has some interesting things to say. In section 6 of that law, it proclaims the following: the Governor General shall have the power to declare by proclamation published in the Gazette any area of Crown land to be a forest reserve. And then it says this: no land shall be granted, devised or sold within a forest reserve. So this law makes it absolutely clear that lands within the forest reserve cannot be given away, cannot be sold, cannot be leased, cannot be used for any other purpose within the forest reserve. Yes? Section 6 of that law.